Welcome, everyone. I recognize some familiar faces, but we have two organizations here, Northeast Wilderness Trust, and we're Mad River Valley Arts. We're an exhibition space that has a program this year that includes art and the environment. So it made sense. My neighbor Caitlin, and I don't see her there around, she came over. She's really the inspiration of this collaboration with Northeast Wilderness Trust. She came over several months ago, and she thought, you know what, I wonder if two organizations in their collaboration could forward the messaging clearer and even more with more impact. So this exhibition here is on trees from a number of perspectives, whether it's using wood as a material, from which ideas spring from wood as material, as well as more conceptual and into the more abstract considerations. So really, I just want to send a thank you to Caitlin for introducing this organization. And Shelby, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Shelby Perry. I'm the Wildland Ecologist at Northeast Wilderness Trust. And I found out when I got here that I can't look at my notes. So we're going to play this game together where I try to remember what I was going to say. So I'm talking today about trees and rewilding to sort of try to talk a little bit about trees in general to get at sort of the content of the show, and then about rewilding, which is kind of what the work that we do at Northeast Wilderness Trust. So in the forest, everything is sort of governed by the changing of seasons, and so I wanted to frame this talk around the changing of seasons from spring to summer to fall to winter. I'm going to really dwell on spring and summer and kind of gloss over fall and winter because we just did that and I don't want to do it again. But we're going to go through those seasons together. I also think about the seasons a little bit as a metaphor for the phases of a forest or a tree's life. So I put some pictures here that go from seed to sort of elder tree. And I was curious, does anybody recognize this seed? Does anybody know what that is? That's a tough one. It's kind of a hard picture too. That's the burr of an American chestnut, which used to be really common in our woods, but it's not that common anymore. And often when you find those burrs, they're sterile because they haven't been fertilized. And then as we go on this journey through the seasons and through the phases of a forest, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of the critters that live in the forest and what how their lives are intertwined. So I wanted to highlight a couple here. So we're going through the seasons, and we're going to start with spring. And because I wanted to make this a little bit more of an immersive experience, I included some sounds. We're in spring right now. There's a lot of sounds you're probably hearing. There's one that's pretty iconic for me. If you want to press that, maybe we'll hear it, which is peepers. There's also some coyotes in the background of this recording. They make that noise all the time, not just in spring, but and some dogs barking. So we're in spring, and it's sort of a period of awakening and rebirth or birth of babies and small, baby animals, or sometimes seeds. I think the peepers are going to come back. And at this time of the year, I saw this today, actually, on my drive down here, you start to see sort of a tinge of color in the tops of the trees. And those are not baby leaves. It's a little bit early for baby leaves. Those are tree flowers. In this picture, we've got red maple flowers, and then this is I think it's a poplar, aspen probably. And so those flowers are the first thing that opens up on trees. The trees pack their buds in the fall before they go dormant. And one of my favorite things to do in the winter, if you find a branch, if there's been a big storm with heavy snow and it breaks branches, we had a bunch of those this winter, and you find a branch on the ground with the buds on it, you can cut off a couple twigs, bring them inside and put them in water, and they'll open their buds. And you might get leaves or you might get flowers. I bring them home a lot, and I've brought home a lot of red maple twigs. And I love it when the flowers open in January or February when everything is white and I need to see a little taste of spring. And so let's look a little closer at those flowers. So these are red maple flowers. Botanically speaking, there are perfect flowers and there are imperfect flowers. This is a botanical term, not a value judgment. These are imperfect flowers, meaning they only have the parts of one sex of the plant. So the red maple tree has separate male and female flowers, usually on separate trees. Sometimes they're on the same tree. Can anyone guess which this is, male or female? Does anybody know? Male? Does everybody agree? Male flowers? Yeah. Yeah, these are boy flowers, and every time I bring them home, I get boys. I don't know why. But you can tell they're boys because these little grains here, these ones are not quite mature yet, but these are anthers. They're the male parts, and the yellow grains are pollen, and the pollen are the male parts of the reproductive process of tree flowers or all flowers, and the female parts are the stigma, and when the pollen gets on the stigma, that develops into the seed on the female flowers. So you'll know you have a female flower if in the maples in particular, you'll start to see those little tiny maple samaras growing in the middle of the flower after they've been pollinated, and it's cool to see. I'm sorry I didn't have a picture of it. After the flowers come the baby leaves. These are probably my favorite part of spring. I love baby leaves. I just think they're so adorable. These are red maple leaves, and they're red, but they aren't going to stay red. This is just sort of part of their early development. The red color is thought to be something that it's a chemical that the tree makes, and it's thought to serve as a kind of a sunscreen when they don't have their chlorophyll yet. And so they're getting out and ready to absorb as much sun as possible, but sun is very damaging. And if they don't have their chlorophyll, which absorbs the sun, they're vulnerable to it, just like our skin. And so they have to protect themselves. And it happens in different ways. And the red color is one of them. That's the theory anyway. That's the latest theory that I've heard. So those are packed in the buds in the fall too. And after your flowers, if you bring some twigs in and your flowers bloom, and then those little blooms dry up, you can pull those off and put them in the compost or outside. And then a little while later, the leaves will come out. But the leaves will come out and then they'll die pretty quickly because they need the tree circulating water and nutrients for them. They can't live in a vase for very long, but it's fun to see them anyway. So then your hillsides go from that sort of red tinge of the flowers to this more of a sort of electric green tinge of the baby leaves. And I thought we would pause here while the leaves are just starting to come out and go beneath the canopy of the trees in the forest and meet some of the critters down below. So here, who knows what the term spring ephemeral is? Have you guys heard spring ephemeral? Spring ephemerals are wildflowers, and they flower beneath the canopy of a forest. This one's hepatica, one of the earliest flowering ones. These are flowering right now around here, so if you're out in the woods, these are limited, I think, more to rich woods, so I don't see them everywhere around here. I see them a lot in the Champlain Valley and in a few places around here. Hepatica is in the buttercup family, and it has pretty variable numbers of petals and colors. It can be anywhere from purple and pink to almost totally white. But they come up early and they have these fuzzy little stems. And what's special about them, about the spring ephemerals in general, is that their whole life cycle is about taking advantage of this moment right now, before the leaves come out, when there's a bunch of sunlight reaching the forest floor. and before it gets shady. So they're gonna flower, and they're gonna get pollinated, and they're gonna set their seeds, and they're gonna go by. And sometimes their leaves last, and sometimes even their leaves go by, all before the leaves come totally out. And so these guys are flowering right now. I think I have just a couple others in here. This one's Spring Beauty. These ones come up, flower, get pollinated, and die before, or die back. They don't totally die, before the leaves come out. And I think I might have, this one's Trout Lily. Probably some of you know Trout Lily. They die back almost completely. Once they're pollinated, this flower head will turn into what's called a corm, and it will weigh down that flower stalk and sort of thunk into the ground in front of it. And sometimes you'll see them, these stem parts will be on the ground, and everything else of the plant is gone. There's just sort of this weird little wormy stem and a little green ball. And that thing is gonna grow into the soil, and they actually grow deeper each year. So when a trout lily is really old, its corm is farther beneath the surface. They grow down as they get older. And some of these, I think Trout Lily is one of them, and the other is Spring Beauty, also have a partnership with ants. And in the spring, they have seeds that have, I think it's called an elaiosome. It has a sugary coating on the seed, and the ants will collect them and take them back into their ant hills and eat the coating off and leave the seed, and then the seeds will germinate and grow from in the ant hills. I think there's more Spring Beauty. I just put 2 because I think they're so cute. Next one is Bloodroot. This one also comes up. The flowers go by really early. They come up totally sort of encased in that leaf. You can see the leaf down here. They're really interesting when they're young. There's like the veins on the back of the leaf covering the flower. Then the flower comes out of the leaf, opens up, goes by, and the flowering stalk goes by, but those leaves stay and get pretty big, and they last for kind of a while. They last longer than when the leaves on the trees come out. So those are the spring ephemerals. Those are some of the flowers that show up in the forest in this time. And let's go next, because I don't remember. Oh, look, ferns. So spring ephemerals have one life philosophy, and that's trying to take advantage of this abundant light on the forest floor in the early spring. Ferns have a different one, forest ferns. They come up now. They're coming up in fiddleheads now. They unfurl. They're one of the reasons there's very little light on the forest floor later on in the summer. Ferns have these big sun-gathering leaves. They unfurl, they open up, and they're specially designed to take advantage of the low light on the forest floor. These forest ferns, there are open ferns, but these ones, so I've got a couple pictures of fiddleheads because I just think fiddleheads are so beautiful. So that last one was Christmas fern, this one's a lady fern, and I think the next one is a lady fern too, but it was just such a neat picture, I put it in here. And those ones are all forest ferns. They're going to open up and live in the forest, and they'll be open fronds for the whole summer. Now, ferns are not seed dispersed, they're spore dispersed. So when they come out, different ones have their fertile parts at different times, but these ones and wood ferns that are really common, a lot of our really common ferns, when they come out, they have the spores on the back of their fronds, and you can, if you turn it over, if you find a fertile frond, you'll see the spores on the back side. And particularly the wood fern, which I don't have a picture of, you can bring them home and look at through a hand lens. And when they get warm, they have little elaters on the spores that'll uncurl and recurl, and they'll actually spring them out from the fern. So if you leave it on the countertop on a piece of white paper, it's sort of hard to see it happening. If you breathe on it a little, it'll happen because the warm and the humidity will cause it to happen. And they'll fling their little spores all over that paper, and you can watch it. It's kind of neat to see. So that's something else I do in the springtime in the forest, is bring home some fern fronds and look at their spores. Oh, and this one is maidenhair fern, which is a really beautiful fern. Probably many of you have seen this in the woods. It's more of a rich site fern, and it has these really interesting fronds that look almost like little ginkgo leaves. Okay, so going back to our seasons, our leaves are opening up, and you might associate summer with sunshine and bright sunny days, but in the forest, summer is really characterized by shade, because that's when the trees' leaves are all out. So it starts to get darker, shadier under the forest canopy. And so the sound that I have for this is a field sound. It's a summer field sound, so I want you to sort of listen to this sound and imagine yourself walking from a hot, sunny field under the cool canopy of the forest, and feel that difference as you go from the hot, sunny field full of crickets to the forest, the shady, cool forest. So that shady, cool forest feels really different, right? It feels cooler, much cooler than that field. And part of that is shade, is just shade. You're in the shade, you were in the sun, now you're in the shade, it feels different. But there's more to it than that. And this is one where I might actually have to run over and look at my notes, because I have some facts and figures here that I'm gonna mess up if I don't check. But each leaf is covered with little holes called stomates, and there's about 1 million of them per leaf. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the size of leaf, but there can be 1 million of them per leaf. And those stomates are what open up and take in carbon dioxide, which is what the trees use for photosynthesis to make their energy, but they also at the same time release water vapor. And I remember this one: an adult tree releases 26 gallons of water, I think it's in the mid-20s, we'll say, gallons of water per day through the stomates in the summer when it's actively photosynthesizing. 26 gallons of water. So trees are responsible for half of the precipitation, snow and rain that falls on land. Half. And it's actually less near the coast and more near the inland. In fact, when you get further inland, it's 100% trees. And around the coast, it's evaporation from the ocean. So trees build clouds and they build rain. And when they're doing that, that's an energetically intensive process to move that much water. And I'm gonna just flip over here and peek at these notes really quick to say that according to the book A Trillion Trees by Fred Pierce, the planet's 3 trillion trees release an estimated 14,400 cubic miles of water per year. So this is what makes clouds and is ultimately responsible for at least half of all the rain that falls on land. And one tree transpires around 26 gallons of water per day, and it has the cooling equivalent of 2 household air conditioning units. So and that's evaporative cooling. That's the water going from the liquid phase to the vapor phase when it comes out. That causes a cooling effect. So forests, they don't only cool you from shade, they cool you from evapotranspiration, and it has a pretty significant and measurable impact on temperatures. You can see those differences in cities, city streets that have trees in them versus city streets that have no trees. You can get anywhere from 2 to 10 degrees difference from one to the other, depending on how many trees there are and what the surroundings are. So you can go to the next slide. Did I already say the things? I think I covered this, but the water comes up from the roots and is released through those stomates. That takes a tremendous amount of energy. Oh, and I think what I wanted to say is that trees, when they pull that water up and they release it and they make clouds and they make rain, what are they doing? They're creating an environment that is favorable to more trees. So they build their own habitat by adding moisture to the air and causing precipitation. And there's an anecdote that I read in that book, A Trillion Trees by Fred Pierce, about an island that was a little volcanic island, and I don't remember where it was, but somewhere on sort of major shipping routes. And it was barren, and they planted several trees there, many, maybe hundreds. And over time, that island grew a whole forest and became what it is now called today, which is, I believe, Green Mountain is what it's called. And the trees built the environment and the climate that more trees needed to survive and more plants needed to survive. So trees building their own habitat, building their own environment and making it more friendly for trees also benefits all the other organisms that rely on trees, including us. We like trees for all sorts of reasons, making art, making our houses, making all sorts of things, heating our homes, but also including all of the animals that live in the forest. There's so many different things that are evolved to live in the forest or in cooperation with trees. And I'm gonna highlight a couple. I think you can go next, there we go. So some familiar ones and some unfamiliar ones. I think we all know the eastern newt. These guys, I call this their Kurt Vonnegut phase. They wander for, it's anywhere from 1 to like 9 or 10 years. These little guys can be in this orange phase and wander around in the forest. They're aquatic in their young stage, and they're aquatic in their fully adult stage. But they have this prolonged sort of finding themselves phase where they just wander the earth as these little orange guys that we know, these little 6-spotted newts. And this is a little tiny, tiny one that I spotted last summer. And wood frogs, we probably associate them with vernal pools and ponds. They quack like little ducks. You've probably heard them in the woods near your property making their little quacking sounds. But they live most of the year in the forest. They come to water just to breed. They spend most of the time in the forest. And they rely, just like the newt, on those moist duff layers and the humid environments of under leaves and under logs to help them from desiccating, to live out their lives in the forest. This is the one-flowered pyrola. I put this in here because I wanted to kind of call to your attention the different character of the light in this picture versus the spring ephemerals. Because now we're under the shade, we're under the leaves, and so everything is green and shady. And those photos that I had of the hepatica and the trout lily and the spring beauty, those were really brown because it was early spring, and also really bright because there were no leaves filtering the light. So I like this flower in particular. Lives under a closed canopy forest. It's its preferred habitat, moist, cool woods. And it's a fairly common forest flower, but the flowers are pointed down, so they're not easily noticed when you're just walking through. And they're an example of a species that relies on that shade from the closed canopy forest. This is a liverwort. I don't know a lot about these. I just think they look so cool that I put a photo of one in here. They live on the moist margins of streams and brooks in the forest, and they grow over rocks and things. They have similar life cycles to mosses, and they're just really neat looking plants. And this is my personal favorite, which is the slime mold, which I slip into every presentation I give. Slime molds are in the kingdom Protista. A lot of people thought they were fungi for a long time. They're now in a totally different kingdom from fungi. They are single-celled organisms that is essentially a giant bag of nucleuses that oozes around on the forest floor, and they're predators. They eat other slime molds and tiny little invertebrates and arthropods and things. And then eventually, at some point, when conditions favor it, they fruit. And that's when we see them like this. Most of their life is a plasmodium. It's like a little slimy guy under the leaves. And then they come out and they fruit on rotting logs and wood and sometimes on trees. They look a lot of different ways. This is one species. And this is actually a pretty unique species. This one's called honeycomb coral slime mold. Kind of looks like an ocean creature. But this grows all over our woods and will be fruiting probably in June or July out here. And if you see something that looks kind of like white crust on a log in the woods, just look a little closer just in case it's one of these, because they're so cool. Okay, we'll keep going. And okay, so I think and streams that flow through old forests they tend to have cooler and clearer water than streams that have more sun or partial canopy. And they make excellent habitat for fish and all kinds of things, including all sorts of insects that have some sort of aquatic phase in their, when they're nymphs, and then they emerge. And push that button one more time. Also, they're predators. So the things that eat those bugs love those cool, cold, clear waters of forested streams. And okay, so we're going back to the seasons, and we're gonna switch now to fall. And so the quintessential sound of fall for me is going for a walk through the woods when the leaves have started to fall. So that's what we're gonna do real quick. These are my very graceful steps, visiting a property that we were looking at to protect last fall, I think. So fall, it's when the leaves change color and fall to the ground. So the quality of the light changes again in the forest. We go from all that green, the whole spectrum of green, to these reds and yellows and oranges. And so I wanted to just, for this season, I thought I would talk a little bit about why the leaves change color. And so chlorophyll is the green pigment that is made in leaves to harvest light to make energy. When trees stop making chlorophyll, the green goes away and the colors that are underneath show through. That's what you see when you're looking at yellow or orange leaves. That's the color they were underneath all the time, but the chlorophyll masked that when they were full of chlorophyll. Red, on the other hand, is something different. Red is made by it's a chemical called a secondary metabolite, which means the trees actually specifically manufacture the red. And we don't know totally why, which I should have been more transparent about when I was talking about it on the baby leaves, but we're not totally sure what anthocyanin does. But the primary theory right now is that it works as a sunscreen. And so it protects the leaves from damage when they're babies and they're not ready to be collecting light. It protects them, and that's why you get that reddish hue. And when they're going by in the fall, you get reddish color, and it's believed to be a sunscreen. And it's essentially because once they abandon those chloroplasts and they don't have a system of harvesting the sunlight anymore, sun is very damaging. We know, we all get sunburns, and it degrades leaves really quickly. They're no more resilient than we are when they don't have their chlorophyll going. So the red is believed to sort of protect those leaves while the tree is trying to harvest out any carbon or sugars that might still be in that leaf before it drops to the ground. And so they turn the red, they get everything they can out, and then they seal off the end of that stem, and the leaves eventually fall to the ground. Once that chlorophyll and sunlight harvesting mechanism is no longer maintained, that process happens pretty quickly, and you'll notice that falls that have a lot of sun tend to have more red leaves, where if it's a really gray, wet year, you get more of those sort of oranges and burnt browns and dark yellow colors, and less of these bright, bright reds. So here's sort of a spectrum of some fall leaves and colors that I pulled together a couple years ago when I was writing an article about these changing colors. So you get all the way from the green to the yellows, which are often just this color that they are underneath, and the oranges, and then the reds are the ones that are a secondary metabolite. That's something that these plants are producing specifically this time of the year. And then the leaves fall. So they're red, they're beautiful colors, they fall, they drop from the trees, they fall to the ground, and they become leaf litter or duff or whatever you want to call them in the forest. In towns and villages, people like to collect them and put them in bags or cart them off. But in the forest, they are a really important part of the sort of process, right? They build soil as they break down. They feed decomposers and, one of my favorite words, detritivores, things that eat the forest garbage. They become an environment, a humid environment where different insects and amphibians and small organisms move around and live. They are an important nursery for seeds and things coming up. So there's an important role for leaves on the forest floor, and actually older forests, one of the functional characteristics you look for when you're looking for an old forest is a really nice thick spongy duff layer, meaning there's lots and lots and lots of layers of organic on top of the soil, and then they sort of, as you go deeper, become more fragmented and eventually become the soil that mixes with the mineral soil underneath. But when you see that snow, we're moving on to our next season, which is winter. So I have a winter sound for us, which is just one of our local birds that sticks around. And we've all probably heard a lot of these guys recently, just our chickadees, one of our resident winter birds. Chickadees are, I've read this in a book, often attracted to loud noises in the woods. And the theory is that if a tree snapped and fell down or something, there might be all kinds of bugs and larvae that are revealed by that broken limb or branch or tree. And so if you are banging around really loud in the woods, sometimes the chickadees will come and be like, what are you doing over here? To see if they can get a snack, because it has rewarded them in the past, I guess. Winter is a time of rest, it's a time of quiet. Everything sort of settles down in the winter. And so I'm not going to dwell on winter. I've already moved on, in fact. So we went through the seasons and we talked a little bit about the different phases, but I wanted to talk about rewilding because that's sort of my day job, but also one of my passions. And so I wanted to bring up that a lot of the forests that we look at here in Vermont and across the Northeast are, if you're looking at this sort of spectrum of a forest from a seed to a seedling to a young forest to an old forest. If you want to push that one more time, I think it's just going to circle this middle zone. We're mostly in this middle zone, young to middle-aged forests. Our forests are, by and large, not more than 50 to 80 years old in Vermont. Some, maybe up to 100 in some places, but a lot of Vermont was cleared, as we all know, a long time ago in the 1800s and before that for farming and for all sorts of reasons, sheep being one of them. And so a lot of our forests are recovering. And a lot of what we know and a lot of where we set our baselines for how we think about forests are based on that recovering forest, because we just have so few examples of true old forest left. I think the estimate is less than 0.5% of the land in Vermont is old growth forest. And according to the Wildlands report released, it was a joint effort between Northeast Wilderness Trust and an outfit called Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. Last fall, they did a sort of comprehensive inventory of wild lands protected as wild across the Northeast, across New England, and came up with 3.3%. So 3.3% of New England is protected as wildlands. This is lands where passive rewilding is sort of what humans have said is okay to happen in these places. We're letting natural processes play out. So rewilding means a lot of things to a lot of people. There's lots of different ways people talk about it. But when we talk about it at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we're talking about passive rewilding. We're talking about leaving places alone to let nature sort of direct the ebb and flow of life in those places, to let them grow old or, come what may, do whatever natural processes want to play out. And we think that deserves a bigger piece of the landscape than 3.3%. Certainly we value all uses of the landscape and understand that wood products are important for things like art and houses and heating, but we think there could be a better balance between wild forests and managed forests. And so that's our mission, is protecting forever wild landscapes for nature and people. And this picture in the background here was taken in the Adirondacks, where there actually is quite a bit more forever wildland, and that experiment is playing out, and there are some larger patches of older forests, but here in Vermont we just don't have very much. And I think I have this picture, which is, so I think a lot of people think of old forests and they think of those giant trees. That last slide was 2 big giant white pines. This is an old growth hemlock forest in a property that Northeast Wilderness Trust owns in Maine called Howland Research Forest. It's about 500-acre old growth hemlock stand, and many of the trees are about this big, but I think the oldest one there is like 380 something years old. So they're not always giant trees, and they still can be old forests where natural processes have been playing out for a long time. You get this coarse woody debris on the forest floor and these beautiful deep moss layers and all sorts of different plants. Here's a great example of those ferns and their life philosophy of collecting as much light as they can close to the forest floor. And so those functions and processes, they've been missing from parts of Vermont for so long, we don't even know what we're missing, I'm afraid. And I like to think of rewilding as one of the more hopeful things in this age, one of the more hopeful ideas where we can say, we can build some of this back, and it's really cheap. You don't have to do anything. You just sort of let it go. And I think it gives me hope for a little bit of a wilder future. So I think that's the end. That was our journey through the seasons. We talked about trees, we talked about rewilding. I just shared sort of some fun facts about forests, but I'm happy to entertain questions or comments from anyone. Let me know what you think.
Shelby,
Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, say we own, 10 acres.
Mm-hmm.
How would we go about rewilding? Like, how much of our property, should we be allowing it in order for this old growth to start kicking in?
So I like to say that rewilding happens at a lot of scales. And if you have 10 acres, you're probably not going to get, well, first of all, I hope nobody thinks that we're going to have an old growth forest to, our properties are not going to be old growth for like 100 years because it takes a really, really long time. But somebody has to start the clock somewhere, right? And so we're saying now, we're committing to this. We're taking these pieces, we're setting them aside, we're letting them grow old, and in a long time, new generations of people are going to get to enjoy the fruits of that effort. And I think that means something and is important, even though I'm not going to get to see it myself. But when we're talking about our own properties and our own land, and we have maybe smaller parcels or just a little patch of lawn or whatever, you can make choices that balance with what you need. So let's say you have a big area of lawn that you mow, and maybe you enjoy croquet, so you want to keep like a nice croquet green mowed. But if you just let some of those edges go and let them just get brushy and thick, and I know we all get really anxious about ticks, but we just have to embrace and let the birds and things eat the ticks. Let your edges go. And me at my house, I bought a house a year and a half ago, and I mowed the lawn the first year, and the second year I just stopped. And what I started doing was mowing little paths through it, so I could walk around without covering myself in ticks. but I could see all the flowers bloomed, all these different things came up and bloomed, and it was so amazing to me how quickly it went from flat, mowed green lawn to one season of not being mowed. And it's so obvious to me where was mowed and where was not mowed now that the snow has melted. The surface of the soil is lumpy and bumpy, and things have been moving around in there. There's bugs and critters and voles and chipmunks making holes, and there's just so much more life in those places that I'm not mowing. So any place that you can just sort of rein in that manicuring a little bit is a little bit of rewilding, and it's at a scale that's beneficial to the small things that fit in that place. You know, everybody's world is sort of their like zone of influence, or whatever you want to call it. Their Umwelt is what Ed Young uses in the book. What is that book called? Anyway, doesn't matter. The Umwelt is the experience of an animal in their senses in the world, and so when I think about like, oh, I only have an acre to do something with, or oh, I only have this sort of 10-foot patch of lawn that I can do something with, if you let half of it go, you're building a home for a whole bunch of really small organisms. And those things like slime molds and frogs and fireflies. Fireflies really like unmowed spaces. I don't know if anybody noticed, they stopped, so I live in Montpelier. They didn't mow any of the cemeteries in Montpelier during COVID-19 lockdowns. And the fireflies in 2020 and 2021 were incredible. And it just took one season of not being mowed, because the fireflies overwinter in that messy duff layer on the ground. They need that stuff. And if you mow it really early, you chop up their larvae, and then you don't have very many fireflies. So there's all sorts of little steps. There's the Backyard National Park is one sort of effort that's aimed at getting people to rewild little pieces of their lawn. There's one in the UK that I like. It's called ARC, Acts of Restorative Kindness. And they encourage you to put a little plaque in front of the areas that you're letting go that say, this is an ARC, with a little information about why, which I thought it was really a neat option. So I think any size can make a difference. Any place can make a difference. If you have a vegetable garden and that's all you have is a little plot, you know, plant some little native wildflowers down at one end and let those go to town, and you'll get some native pollinators, and you'll get, you know, different things than you would get if you just kept a vegetable garden. So everybody can do a little bit on whatever size they have. Yeah.
That was great, thank you. I'd
Yeah.
like to spend a day in the woods. So rewilding is a new concept for me, out of the School of Conservation. This is rewilding, and you've talked about rewilding as being passive, but the little bit I know is that there's sort of active rewilding as well, introducing keystone species, and more other things. So can you spend a minute talking about sort of your organization's decision to be passive versus active, and I think we sort of can all assume some of the downfalls of introducing new keystone species, even if they were there, but they haven't been for 100 years.
Yeah.
A lot about that.
Yeah, so rewilding, early rewilding, when it first sort of became a concept in the zeitgeist, there were 3 C's, cores, corridors, and carnivores. And that was what they were talking about. They were talking about protecting big areas of core habitat, corridors connecting them, and your keystone species, your carnivores. The term has sort of evolved since then to encompass a lot of other things, including passive rewilding, which is what we were really talking about at Northeast Wilderness Trust. Our reason, why we do it that way is we're a land trust, and so we have only so many tools in our toolbox, and one of the things that we do very well is purchase and protect land, and we believe that we can sort of step back and let nature decide what happens in those properties. And so that's our process of passive wilding. For me, it's kind of, it feels like a bit of an act of humility. It's about saying we don't know what's best, and so we can let some places decide for themselves. And that idea, that concept is what we apply on our properties. We are not involved in more active sort of management style rewilding where people are making big changes on the landscape. We aren't even really doing active restoration on our properties where, you know, every once in a while we'll do a tree planting if there's like a log landing or something that's just needs a little kind of kick in the butt to get going. But for the most part, we're just sort of saying, we don't know what's best here. We're going to let nature decide. And that was really intentional in our founding, going back to, we're 25 now, is that right? 25 years old. We had our 20th a couple years ago. We're almost 25. So going back to the founding of Northeast Wilderness Trust, that was sort of always the goal, was sort of wilderness as a baseline, wilderness as a place where people aren't picking the winners and losers, and that's really what we've committed to. And I think, so to kind of put that in the atmosphere of all other conservation, people do sort of nature protection, people do working forest protection, people do farmland protection. All of that conservation is really important. Often it has a certain goal in mind. Farmland protection is, yes, about, like, you probably heard cows, not condos. It's about protecting farmland, keeping farmland farms. That's really important. Working forest protection, that's about keeping big blocks that like make sense for managing forests, because as Vermont gets parcelized, it gets less and less profitable and manageable for people to do real timber harvest, and that our rural economies depend on that kind of stuff. So that's really important. But both of those things have a pretty human focus, right? We're meeting a human goal for the land. And same with even some natural areas protection is often about a human experience of the landscape. It's got a recreation focus or a certain, things that we like to see, views, and there's an organization called Scenic Hudson that protects the views around the Hudson River, and that's one of their mission statements. So ours is really, we're trying to fill the gap of being an organization that's more focused on non-human needs and places in the landscape, more ecocentric. So we're trying not to center those human needs in our conservation. Not to say those aren't important, they're all really important. This is just another piece in the puzzle. Did you want to?
So I'm thinking about state land, federal land, and also land that's currently managed for recreation. Mm-hmm. Starting at the end and going backwards. When I think of recreation, Mad River Glen is privately owned. And I remember a bunch of years ago talking to the people, basically board members, about what their plan was for the forest. Let's cut firewood, let's do this, and they're like, no, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to maintain the trails. If something falls down in a trail, we'll cut it. Hito will know more about this than I do. But basically, their management plan is don't do anything.
Yeah.
Does something like that qualify, or is it already too fragmented because of the trail system and the recreational use?
So I always like to say wilderness exists at many scales. It all matters to me. Every place that gets to be wild matters to me. I think it's important. It's important at a different scale than really big pieces, but it's still really important. Those habitats of unmanaged forest between ski trails, those are really important breeding habitat for certain forest birds that don't mind the disturbance of the ski trail, but want a quiet place for their nests that isn't disturbed regularly. So there are different things that benefit from wilderness at any scale. And I think it's just about, we're not picking winners and losers, right? We're not doing this with anyone in mind, but it is really great to see who benefits from each piece protected at each scale.
So does that mean can you go to the state and say, look, we found this chunk that you guys own. Can you like give it to us to, and please don't cut any more, you know. I mean, I make my living with wood.
Yeah.
Have my whole my life. And mostly locally grown forest stuff. Mm-hmm. But do you have, I mean, are federal and state land holdings part of what you guys are doing? Or do they just see you coming and say, no way, go away?
We don't work on public lands at all. We're a private land protection or private land conservation organization. So we purchase private lands from willing sellers on the open market and protect it as wilderness. And we do sometimes put conservation easements on private landowners who want their land protected as wild. Often they're other conservation organizations, and we're doing sort of a dual level of protection there. The state has designations that are similar to wildland, like natural areas. State designated natural areas are not supposed to be managed for wood products or certain things like that. Often they have a recreational component. So the state is working, they have mechanisms for that. Federal lands has national or federal wilderness, you know, the National Wilderness Protection Act. So there are federally designated wilderness areas in the Green Mountain National Forest and the White Mountain National Forest. So those are sort of separate from the work we're doing, but complementary. And the state is thinking about this in a really big way right now with Act 59, which is the 30 by 30 bill, where they're talking about those ecological protection areas, and they're trying to define what that means to them. And so if you're interested in that process and haven't been engaged, they've had a great big comment period, and I recommend anybody just reach out. They have a big website. VHCB, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, is sort of running the commentary. And then they're partnered with a group called Nature for Justice, who are running some focus groups and things to get people's input on that. And if this kind of thing is interesting to you from sort of any facet, how the state is thinking about designations on state land, that would be a great process to get engaged in.
Can you explain evapotranspiration? So if the trees are pulling 26 gallons of water against gravity, upward, what are the physicality of this? How does it happen?
That's a great question. I took tree physiology 9 years ago, and so it's not super fresh in my memory, but what I do remember is that it's not super well understood. We don't really know. It's a really effective mechanism for moving water, and it's not clear really how they do it. I know capillary action is involved to some extent. Those stomates open to pull in carbon dioxide, which is, so photosynthesis, we'll go back to grade school here. Photosynthesis is like CO2 plus light, breaks down the CO2, makes oxygen and carbon, which is turned into sugars and stored in the tree. That process requires CO2, so they have to open those stomates for the CO2 to get in. In times of intense drought, that the trees will limit how much they can actually photosynthesize, and sometimes they will stop photosynthesizing altogether because they have to keep those stomates closed because they don't want to lose that water, because they know they can't replace it from the ground. So in times of extreme drought, trees will even drop a ring. They won't put on an annual growth ring on parts or all of the tree if they don't get enough water, because they can't afford to open those stomates and lose the water. They'll desiccate. So some of it is passive. Some of it is just when they open those stomates, it kind of gets pulled out as part of high concentration to low concentration movement of molecules. And some of it is active. And I don't know. Maybe somebody knows. I don't know. And last time I checked, it wasn't super well understood.
Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on invasives and how that fits into let nature be nature when they're also a result of human activity?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I have a really unpopular opinion on it.
Can you repeat the question? Can you guys hear? Okay.
The question is how Northeast Wilderness Trust and me personally, thinks about invasives in a wild area, given that invasives come from people. They were introduced here by people, generally speaking. I personally, so right now I'm not speaking for Northeast Wilderness Trust, I'm speaking for myself. I personally think we need to take a hard look at how we think about invasives. I have a lot of concerns I know that they're bad for biodiversity and that in some cases they are harming native species, but on the other hand, I have a handful of concerns. One is that we are teaching a whole generation of young people that there is good nature and there is bad nature, and that they should hate this part of it and kill it and rip it out and get rid of it. But this part of it is good and we love it. And I don't think that is going to build the conservationists that we want in the future. I really worry about the message that sends. And a lot of the way that we talk about invasive species is really value-laden and sometimes dark. And I worry about that. I don't like the message that sends. The other thing I will say is that I've dug into this issue really deeply. So Fred Pierce, who wrote the book 1 Trillion Trees that I referenced, he wrote another book called, I think it's called The New Wild or A New Wild. He's a great science journalist who goes down the rabbit holes, and I recommend that book for anyone who's really interested in learning more about invasive species. A lot of the numbers that are thrown around about the dangers of invasive species and the extinctions that they cause are worldwide or sometimes nationwide averages, and they include islands. And invasive species on islands are really different things than invasive species on mainlands. They do drive extinctions on islands in a big way, particularly mammals introduced to islands that have birds that don't know how to fly. And those change all of the statistics, all of the numbers, and those are usually included. So when you see someone put a price tag on what invasive species costs, sometimes those price tags are including islands. Sometimes those price tags are including agricultural pests and what we're spending on weeds in soybean fields in the Midwest. Sometimes one of those numbers that I've come across a couple of times actually assigns an arbitrary value to every songbird killed by feral cats of, I think it was $20, and then multiplies it by their estimated number of songbirds that are killed by cats, and then uses that number to say invasive species causes this much damage. And that is often applied when people are talking about plants. And they're just not the same thing. So invasive species are tricky. They're not easy to deal with. I think you have to have a ton of nuance when you talk about it. I don't think there's an easy answer. We don't right now manage invasive species on our property at Northeast Wilderness Trust. And now I'm speaking as a Northeast Wilderness Trust employee again. We don't manage invasive species, terrestrial herbaceous invasive species, in part because most of them get their competitive advantage from disturbance. And management is creating disturbance. And we don't want to use pesticides or chemicals, so our options are hand pulling or cutting. And that essentially creates exactly the conditions that more invasive species need to move in or they need to spread. Our hope is that places that are left alone will get shady with that closed canopy forest, and they just won't have that competitive edge. The other thing I'll say is that, like anything, those populations go way up, and then they start to find, as native species learn to eat them and interact with them, use them as food, or pathogens, pests find them and infect them, those populations are going to start to go down. I read some really early diaries from Darwin's time where they talked about all the horrible weeds that were plaguing the the old world from the US and how those were like the most noxious plants ever. And same with here, the English weeds were the most pernicious in the American countryside. And all the plants that they named as being everywhere and taking over are things that we consider naturalized now, that we look at them and say, these are not a problem, they're just here coexisting. So I think there's a really long arc on these things, and it's really hard to have perspective when you're in the middle and it feels like you're being invaded. But I think the reality is a much more nuanced than a lot of people make it out to be. And I think I never think using pesticides and chemicals to control them is appropriate on nature preserves, on wildlands. Maybe if you have a sugar bush or a wood lot and your invasive shrubs are preventing tree regeneration, you need to take decisive action. That might be an appropriate moment. But when we're talking about nature preserves, I just don't think I can fully grapple with the unintended consequences that I might be having by taking these actions. So I prefer the conservative no action alternative. Yeah.
I was going to ask that question, but also I would like to just say non-native invasive species, because we do have native invasive species that are fine. But it's the non-natives we're concerned about. The other thing I wanted to say is with climate change, these are the plants that are surviving. These are the plants that are thriving, and our other ones are failing. So I think that arc we're talking about is a very different arc now.
Totally, yeah. And I'll also, thank you for making that point, and I'll add to it that, like I said, our forests are all fairly young compared to what what was here pre-European colonization. A lot of the forests were much older, much more rooted in natural processes. And so our forests coming back are a really different environment than many of our native plants evolved with. Some, like ostrich fern and jewelweed, are like going gangbusters. They're doing great. Those ones are sometimes called native invasives now. Others that need that shade, that moist, dark, cool canopy, they're losing their competitive edge. And I think the only way we can give it back is by increasing that 3.3% of wildlands and building more old forests into the matrix of community types and giving them a place that is that wild, undisturbed sort of, what they evolved with. And climate change is the wild card. Everything's going to change. The things that are doing bad now are in trouble if the climate keeps going. So pouring a bunch of pesticides out on the countryside to try to save plants that are struggling now, knowing the trajectory of climate change, feels short-sighted to me, but that's just my opinion. Any other questions? Oh, is there one right here? Oh, sorry.
I'm wondering if you could give a couple examples of some of the land that has been preserved in Vermont or New England, and also an example of, you said your organization comes from the perspective of passive, and I wonder if you could give an example of active wilding, either in the U.S. or in New England. Just curious.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with question one, which is some examples of places we protect in Vermont. I'll give you the more recent, some of the more recent exciting examples are, we protected a place we're calling Bear's Nest Wilderness Preserve. It's, Caitlin, help me, 4,000 acres plus or minus, 3,000? 3,000 plus or minus acres. It's up in Richford, Vermont. I've been there. There's a lot of them. It's up in Richford, Vermont. It's a beautiful property in the Cold Hollow to Canada corridor, connected to a bunch of state forests, so it's sort of adding that wild core. So that one was recently protected this January. And then before that, we did the Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve, which is my personal favorite because it's close to me and also I know the property very well. That one's about 6,000 acres. It is in Woodbury, also Elmore and Worcester and Hardwick a little bit. We pieced that together from a couple different pieces, and that one was protected in 2021. And so it's just beginning the rewilding. So both of these properties were timber properties before and are just getting started on their rewilding journey. I would say Woodbury Mountain has pieces that are further, well, both of them have pieces that are further along. The really hard to get to places tend to have older forests. And they're somewhat complicated to access, which is part of why they make good wilderness preserves. But they're really neat places. We have a BioBlitz series going on Woodbury Mountain right now where we're doing walks once a month-ish out there. We have a bird walk coming up in the beginning of May. Check out anywilderness.trust.org to learn more. And then the second question was active rewilding. And a great example of that is Rewilding Scotland. They have just all sorts of really neat stuff going on there, but one of them is they're replanting some of the forests that were, so Scotland was, what's the word I'm looking for? De-treed. Clear cut, I don't know. Was deforested, there we go. I was just having one of those moments. Sometimes when you talk a bunch, you forget words. It was broadly deforested. Huge areas were broadly deforested and became, open. And now they have a bunch of red deer there who eat the heck out of whatever tries to grow. And so there are big rewilding efforts there aimed at planting trees, preventing overbrowsing to get things up past the browse line, and they even considered briefly a lynx reintroduction, I believe, a European lynx reintroduction. I don't think that went anywhere, but it was a cool effort. And so there's lots of active rewilding going on in Scotland that is really fascinating. I follow that, and I recommend looking that up to learn more about those active efforts. Did you want to ask a question?
I was just asking if there's anything in the valley or in the neighborhood.
No, we don't have anything right in the neighborhood. What would be closest to here? We've had a couple prospects over the years, but nothing has panned out right in the valley yet. But we're interested, so if you have a big chunk of forest land, let us know.
It's not in the valley, the Babysitter's Swamp and the other one are not too far from here.
Oh, yeah, we've got some up in Jericho area. Those are easements on private land. Babysitter Swamp is owned by Sue Morse. Do you guys know Sue Morse, wildlife tracker? It's called Babysitter Swamp because it's where she discovered that big old white pines near a swamp are where mama bears will stash their cubs while they go forage in the swamp. And so that property has some big old white pines by a beaver pond or beaver swamp, and those were babysitters. So that's why it's called Babysitter Swamp, babysitter trees. All right, I think that's it.